The trouble started, as it usually does, with wet weather. The spring of 1987 arrived in Clapton Moor, North Yorkshire, cold and sodden, the kind of spring that turns the footpaths to paste and keeps the mud on your boots from one week to the next. Raymond Elwick, 54 years old, third-generation market gardener, had been working the same 11 acres east of the Darlington Road since 1963. He knew wet springs. He had endured 8 of them in the previous decade alone. But the spring of 1987 was something else. The rains came in off the Pennines in mid-March and barely let up through May. By the time Raymond walked his brassica rows on the morning of April 2nd, the damage was already done. The slugs had found his cabbages. He'd seen slug pressure before. Every grower on that stretch of the Vale of York had. It was part of the cost of farming heavy, moisture-retaining soil in the north. But what Raymond found that April morning was not ordinary slug pressure. He counted the damage on 41 consecutive plants before he stopped counting. Leaves reduced to mid-ribs. Seedlings severed at the base. 3 full rows of hispy cabbage he'd planted out in late February were gone. Not damaged, gone. He estimated the loss at 400 transplants before he had even reached the far end of the bed. He walked back to the stone outbuilding at the top of the field. Sat on the wooden step his grandfather had worn smooth over 40 years of sitting on it. Made a cup of tea from the thermos he brought every morning. Did the arithmetic. At the going rate for hispy at Thirsk Market, those 400 plants represented roughly 280 pounds in lost income. The leek bed, if it had taken the same pressure overnight, would be another 190 pounds. He hadn't checked the leek bed yet. He sat on that worn step and looked down the length of his field, the soil dark and gleaming with moisture, the rows that should have been green and weren't. He finished his tea. Then he went to check the leek bed. It was worse than the cabbages. Raymond Elwick had been using metaldehyde slug pellets since 1971, 16 years. He bought them in 25-kilogram sacks from Metcalfe's Agricultural in North Allerton, a 40-minute drive up the A167. He applied them at the label rate of 60 grams per 10 square meters, sometimes heavier, when the forecast called for wet nights. The cost ran to about 340 pounds per season, spread across 4 or 5 applications through the spring flush and again in autumn. He had accepted this as an ordinary and fixed expense, the same as seed, the same as diesel for the Massey Ferguson, the same as the annual inspection fee on his small polytunnel off the south end of the field. The spring of 1987 was the first year the pellets simply did not work. He reapplied after the first rain washed the initial application into the soil. Applied again 3 days later when the slugs came back. Bought a second 25-kilogram sack from Metcalfe's in the first week of April. A third sack by the end of the month. He was spending money faster than the growing season could return it. The slugs ate through every application. The soil moisture was too high, the surface compaction in the wetter beds too severe for the pellets to form any meaningful barrier before they dissolved. He spoke to Derek Ashworth at Metcalfe's about it, told him the standard formulation wasn't holding. Derek told him to try ferric phosphate granules, newer product, launched in 1986, costlier at 28 pounds a sack against 19 pounds for the metaldehyde. Raymond bought a sack, drove it home, applied it to the 2 beds he'd replanted with fresh transplants in late April. It performed the same. His neighbor on the western boundary, a retired secondary school teacher named Jeffrey Pugh, who had converted 4 of his 5 acres to vegetables, in 1983 came to the farm gate in the 3rd week of April. Said he'd had the same season. Said his spring brassica was effectively finished. Said the pellet cost was beginning to outpace the potential return on the crop, which was a thing he'd been working out on the back of an envelope. And he didn't like the numbers. Raymond told him he wasn't ready to call the season done. Pugh went back through the gate and Raymond went back down the field. By the end of May, Raymond had spent 740 pounds on chemical slug control since the 1st of March. He had brought the transplant loss on his brassica beds down from catastrophic to severe. Not good, severe. He sat with his accounts ledger one evening at the kitchen table, the ledger open to the spring column, and looked at the figures for a long time. His wife Marjorie set a cup of tea next to his elbow. He didn't reach for it immediately, just sat with the numbers. She didn't say anything. She'd seen the fields. She knew what the numbers meant. He closed the ledger and drank the tea. The following Saturday, Raymond drove into Harrogate on an errand he'd been putting off for 3 weeks, collecting replacement propagation trays from a horticultural supplier on the Skipton Road whose unit smelled permanently of damp peat and fertilizer. While he was there, He stopped at the small agricultural reference library attached to the North Yorkshire County Extension offices on the floor above. He had never been to the library before. He was not sure what he was looking for when he climbed the stairs. He was looking for something that was not another sack of pellets, another application schedule, another product that would dissolve in the first rain. He wasn't sure that kind of information was in a library. He went up anyway. The library occupied 2 rooms. The main room held extension publications and county survey reports, the kind of official documents written for official purposes that tend to say very sensible things very cautiously. The second room, smaller, was given over to miscellaneous trade pamphlets, grower notes, and photocopied circulars that had been donated or deposited over the years without any systematic filing. A sign on the cabinet said the material was available to read on the premises but not to borrow. Raymond spent an hour in the second room. He found it in a filing cabinet drawer that had not been sorted properly. Between a leaflet on polytunnel ventilation from 1981 and a guide to identifying red spider mite printed on orange card, there was a 4-page photocopied document in a manila folder with no label. The paper stock was thin. The text had been typed on a manual typewriter, and the ribbon had been wearing thin by the time it was produced. The letters were faint in places, particularly on the 3rd page. The document was titled Notes on Integrated Slug Control in Market Vegetable Production. It was dated April 1979. The author was listed simply as A. Keene, Worcestershire. Raymond read it standing next to the filing cabinet. Read it through once, then went back to the first page and read it through again. Albert Keene had been a market vegetable grower in the Vale of Evesham. He wrote without flourish or sentiment. He described slug pressure in practical terms, the annual cost, the limitations of chemical controls in wet seasons, the particular problem of metaldehyde in high-moisture soils, which he had observed across 7 growing seasons from 1972 to 1978. The first 2 pages of the pamphlet contained nothing Raymond hadn't seen in other documents. The 3rd page was different. Beginning halfway down page 3, Keene described a trial he had begun in 1975 after a particularly damaging spring. He had started running Indian runner ducks through his brassica and leek ground, not free range across the entire holding, not at random. He had developed a specific management rotation, worked out through 2 seasons of observation and adjustment. Ducks moved through harvested or cleared fallow ground in the weeks prior to planting, working the soil surface and the first 2 inches of disturbed earth for slugs, slug eggs, and overwintering larvae. Then, as crops were established, Keene had designed a portable low fence system using galvanized stock netting and timber stakes, 32 inches high, that created defined lanes or paths running between the crop rows. The ducks worked the paths. They took slugs from the soil surface, from the bases of plant stems, from the undersides of leaf litter and crop residue along the bed margins. They did not eat into established crops. They had not, as far as Keene could observe, required any training to restrict themselves to the paths. They had learned the paths within 5 to 8 days and maintained them thereafter. The pamphlet gave a cost breakdown. Materials for 100 yards of portable fence, approximately 78 pounds in 1975. 12 ducks at $3.50 each, 40 pounds. Annual feed cost for 12 birds, roughly 60 pounds. Annual pellet expenditure before the trial. Keene's 1978 slug control costs, 60 pounds feed only. His 1978 transplant loss figures showed a 74% reduction compared to his 1974 baseline, the worst year he had recorded. He had not purchased a single bag of slug pellets since the spring of 1976. Raymond folded the pamphlet carefully, looked at the cabinet sign that said the material was not to be borrowed, left it on the table in the second room, asked the woman at the extension office desk whether he could get a photocopy made. She charged him 5p a page. He paid 20p for the 4 pages, thanked her, and drove home with the copy folded in his jacket pocket. He read it again after dinner. Read it a 3rd time at 6:30 the following morning with the kitchen light on and the field still gray through the window. He was looking for the flaw in it, looking for the thing Keene had overlooked, or the condition in the Vale of Evesham that wouldn't translate to North Yorkshire. He didn't find one. The principle was simple and it was sound. Slugs were the problem. Indian runner ducks ate slugs. The challenge was keeping the ducks productive without letting them damage the crops. Keene had solved the management problem with the portable fence paths. The solution cost less per season than the problem it replaced. Raymond got a piece of paper and drew his field from memory. 11 acres, roughly rectangular, longer north to south. The stone outbuilding at the top, the polytunnel south. He sketched the main growing beds. He drew possible fence path routes. He counted the bed boundaries that could be converted to duck lanes. He worked out a stocking rate based on Keene's figures and adjusted upward slightly for the wetter conditions in Yorkshire, where he expected slug pressure to run higher than Worcestershire. He arrived at 8 ducks as a working starting point, possibly 10. He showed the sketch to Marjorie. She looked at it for a minute, asked if the ducks would be noisy. He said runner ducks were notably quieter than most breeds. She asked how long before he'd know if it worked. He said 1 season. 1 full season from transplant to harvest would tell him what he needed to know. She said that seemed sensible. In June of 1987, Raymond made inquiries through the classified section of the Yorkshire Farming Journal for Indian runner duck breeders within reasonable distance. He found a waterfowl keeper named Thomas Carr in the village of Skeeby, 7 miles north of Richmond, who kept a flock of 80 birds and sold young stock throughout the summer. Raymond telephoned on a Tuesday evening, arranged to collect 8 birds at the weekend. Carr charged £5 each, total. Raymond drove up in the transit on the Saturday morning and brought them home in a ventilated wooden crate he'd lined with straw, 8 slim upright birds with the characteristic near-vertical posture of the runner breed, dark fawn in color, calm in the crate. He built the portable fence system over the following 2 weekends. Materials from Langston's fencing supplier in Skipton, galvanized stock netting at £34 per meter, timber stakes at £80 each, ring top fasteners, a wire tensioner. He cut and built the system to Keene's dimensions, 32 inches high, stakes at 2-meter intervals. He constructed 4 sections of 25 meters each, giving him 100 meters of portable fencing he could reconfigure depending on which beds were in use. Total material cost, £91. He had estimated £85 and was £7 over. He noted this in the accounts ledger. He put the ducks to work in the last week of June on the cleared ground at the north end of the field where the spring brassicas had failed. 6 inches of standing water had drained from that end by early June, leaving the soil soft, open, and heavily populated with gray field slugs and the smaller keeled slugs that did the worst damage to transplant stems. The ducks moved through the cleared beds in the morning and again in the late afternoon when slug activity was highest. They worked systematically, which was the word Raymond kept returning to when he thought about it afterward. Not randomly, systematically, they quartered the ground. They probed under flattened crop residue. They worked the soil surface along the bed shoulders where slugs congregated in damp conditions. He observed them for the first 3 days in the evenings, standing at the top of the field with his tea. By the 4th day, he had gone back to other work. 2 of his neighbors saw the ducks from the road during the first week of July. Raymond heard about the remarks from Marjorie, who had heard them from Pugh's wife at the post office in the village. He didn't repeat the remarks to himself. He had heard the general shape of them clearly enough from the brief and carefully neutral way Marjorie had mentioned them. He went back to the field. He planted his autumn brassica transplants in the first week of August. 83 Savoy cabbages, 60 tundra, 112 January king. He moved the 8 ducks to the fence paths as the transplants went in, keeping them off the planted beds and along the margins between rows. He walked the rows every other morning at 6. Crouching at intervals to examine the soil surface and the plant bases. By the end of the first week, 2 transplants showing slug grazing, both recoverable. In the equivalent first week of April, before the ducks, under chemical controls he'd applied 2 days earlier, he had lost 41 transplants from the spring planting. He did not write this comparison in the ledger. He already knew it. The second week, no new losses. The ducks worked the paths morning and evening. He adjusted 1 fence section on the Thursday to bring them closer to the eastern margin where the ground stayed wettest longest. They found the new path by the 2nd morning. By the end of August, cumulative transplant losses, 6 plants from 255. Raymond wrote this in the ledger. The number was so far from anything in his experience of spring slug control that he checked it twice before writing it down. September brought drier conditions, the first sustained dry period since February. Slug pressure across the whole district fell. Raymond kept the ducks on their rotation regardless, wanting a full season's figures, not a partial picture shaped by weather. The ducks continued working. He adjusted their range as beds were harvested and cleared, moving the fence sections to new ground, keeping them in front of the following planting schedule. The work took him perhaps 20 minutes each morning. He did not find this excessive. He pulled the last of the January king in the second week of November. Final transplant survival rate for the 1987 autumn season, 97.6%. He had not achieved 97% in any season since 1975, when the summer had been dry enough to suppress slug populations without chemical intervention. He sat with the ledger for a moment when he wrote this, then closed it. He spent nothing on slug pellets in the second half of 1987, nothing on ferric phosphate, nothing at Metcalfe's. The spring of 1988 was wetter than 1987 had been in March and April. Raymond expanded the flock to 12 birds in February, buying 4 additional runners from Carr in Skebe at the same price. He built a 5th fence section to extend the duck paths into the leek field, where spring slug pressure had previously been most difficult to control. He planted out his spring brassica 10 days earlier than he would have risked with chemical controls alone. His transplant losses for the full 1988 season, 4.1%. The 1987 figure before the ducks arrived had been 62% for spring brassicas. He had been farming this land for 25 years, and he had never recorded a figure this low in a wet spring. He did not contact Albert Keene. He had tried to trace a grower by that name in the Vale of Evesham in the autumn of 1987, writing a letter to the Worcestershire National Farmers Union office, asking if they had a record of a member of that name. He received a polite reply 3 weeks later saying they had no member currently registered under that name and could not speak to historical records prior to 1983. The pamphlet was 8 years old by then. Keene might have retired, might have moved. Raymond had no other way to reach him. He kept the photocopy in the drawer under the kitchen windowsill with the seed catalogs. In the spring of 1989, Geoffrey Pugh came over the gate on a Saturday morning in March and stood in the yard asking Raymond what feed mix he was using for the ducks. He said this with studied casualness, the way a person asks a specific question while implying a broader one. Raymond told him a basic layers pellet at 120 grams per bird per day, supplemented with grain scatter in the working areas to encourage the birds to cover ground more thoroughly. Pugh wrote this down on the back of his hand. He bought 4 Indian runners from a breeder in Ripon the following week. Raymond went over to Pugh's place on a Saturday in May to help set the portable fence path on his holding. Pugh had 4 acres of leeks and brassicas in a long strip running south to north, slightly different configuration from Raymond's 11 acres, but the same basic drainage challenges. They worked for 4 hours with fence stakes and netting. Didn't talk much while they worked. Pugh asked one question, which was how long before the ducks would learn to stay on the paths without supervision. Raymond said usually by the end of the first week, sometimes 5 days. He said you'd know they had it when you stopped finding them trying to work into the crop beds. Pugh's transplant losses in 1989, 11%, down from 58% in 1988. By 1991, 3 other growers from the district had come to Raymond with the same questions. A woman who ran 4 acres of organic salad leaves 2 miles north of Clapton Moor. An older man named Stout who grew leeks on heavy clay land near Bedale and had been losing 40 to 50% of his transplants to slugs every wet spring for the past 6 years. A young couple from Ripon who had taken on an 8-acre mixed holding in 1990 and had their first spring badly damaged before they'd had time to establish a chemical program. Raymond showed each of them the fence path layout, showed them the stocking density Keene had recommended and the modifications he had made for northern growing conditions. He did not charge for this, did not think of it as a system he had invented. It was a method he had found in a filing cabinet in Harrogate and applied on his own land. The results spoke for themselves. The results had been speaking for themselves for 4 growing seasons. He gave each of them a photocopy of Keene's pamphlet. In the 14 years between 1987 and his retirement in 2001, Raymond Elwick never bought a bag of slug pellets, not metaldehyde, not ferric phosphate, not any of the newer formulations that came through Metcalfe's catalog in the early 1990s. He received the catalogs in the post each February, the way he always had. He looked through them for seed and feed prices. He set the slug control pages aside without reading them. He kept a rough running cost comparison in the accounts ledger from 1988 onward, not in any formal way, just a note at the end of each year's spring column. The chemical control years had cost him an average of £340 annually. The duck management years, feed, occasional new birds to maintain flock strength, fence maintenance, ran to 75 pounds in a typical year. The worst year was 1994, when he replaced 3 fence sections that had rusted through and restocked 4 birds lost to a fox. That year came to 130 pounds, still less than half the pellet cost in a routine season. Between 1987 and 2001, the saving over the chemical program, approximately 3 pounds, 400 in direct costs. This did not account for the revenue from the crops he had not lost to slugs. He did not calculate that figure. The ledger did not have a column for what didn't happen. He also sold eggs. The 12 runners produced more fertilized eggs than he could use, and he left a crate at the farm gate every second Saturday from April through October. A market trader from North Allerton named Dennis Firth collected them and sold them at the Wissenskool market. Firth paid Raymond £1.40 up per dozen. The flock produced on average 18 dozen sellable eggs per month across the 7-month active season. This ran to just over 175 pounds per year. It was not a significant income stream. It covered the feed cost for the ducks with a small margin. Raymond noted it in the ledger every year without particular comment. Raymond Elwick farmed the 11 acres east of the Darlington Road until the spring of 2001. He retired at 68. Sold the holding to a young couple, Sarah and Paul Nightingale, who had been looking for a small mixed vegetable holding for 2 years and had found this one through a solicitor in North Allerton. They were from Leeds originally, 31 and 34 respectively. No farming background, clear about what they didn't know, which Raymond considered a reasonable starting point. When he showed them around before the sale completed, he showed them the stone outbuilding and the folded fence sections stacked against the back wall, the timber stakes bundled with baling twine. He told them about the ducks, told them the method, told them to find 12 Indian runners and to give them a week on the paths before they trusted them with established crops. He told them about the Keen pamphlet, which he left in the kitchen drawer along with the seed catalogs. The Nightingales ran their first season in 2001. They acquired 11 Indian runners from a breeder in Harrogate in April, set the fence paths in May, planted their spring brassica in the last week of May. Their transplant losses that first